audiences knew where they could find what they wanted. The BBC did its main television news at 9 o'clock. ITV's was on an hour later.
The news now on BBC One, and at 9:25, Kojak finds himself in a tricky situation. In tonight's story, Trade-Off.
This is the 9 o'clock news. Good evening. British Steel's chief confirms there'll have to be up to 20,000 redundancies in the industry. The nation pays its final tribute to Earl Mountbatten of Burma, victim of the IRA. His funeral service at Westminster Abbey was attended by the whole royal family and leaders from many parts of the world. One of them, the Irish Prime Minister, Mr. Lynch, later had talks with Mrs. Thatcher, and they agreed on the need for greater cooperation on security. And tonight's other major stories. In Blackpool, the Trades Union Congress have rejected a call for mass protests at the government's economic policies. The American Secretary of State has asked for urgent talks with Moscow about Soviet combat troops in Cuba. And the British businessman released in Sardinia says his kidnappers want an £11 million ransom for his wife and daughter. Good evening. The body of Lord Mountbatten has been buried in Rumsey Abbey near his family home, Broadlands in Hampshire.
One survivor lucky enough to emerge from the Algerian earthquake, but thousands are still buried in the rubble. Engineering workers are being recommended by their union leaders to settle for an 8% pay rise. 5,000 jobs in plants making artificial fibres are being weighed in the balance by ICI. We followed the latest moves in the tussle for the Labour Party leadership. And we see a new way for city dwellers to get a taste of country life. Good evening. With cranes, with bulldozers, and with their bare hands, the rescue teams of El Asnam continue their search of the ruins of the Algerian city.
In 35 minutes here on BBC One, we go to St George's Hall, Windsor Castle, for the magnificent banquet given by Her Majesty the Queen in honour of President Reagan. Now, the 9 o'clock news with John Humphreys.
Israeli troops push on towards Beirut. Palestinian resistance is fierce. President Reagan, making history at Westminster, praises Britain over the Falklands. And in more informal mood, he goes riding with the Queen at Windsor. A Liberian supertanker is attacked by a warplane well outside the Falklands war zone. The British say it wasn't us. And we have the first pictures of British troops landing at San Carlos Bay. Good evening. In the Middle East, as in the Falklands, two armies confront each other. For both Israel and Britain, military force is seen as the only option.
Here on BBC One in 25 minutes, Part 8 of Diana by R.F. Deltafield. That's at 9:25 and follows the 9 o'clock news now with John Humphreys.
Unions concede the government's got its way over Cheltenham, and the handful who've defied the ban. Soccer hooligans a disgrace to Britain, says Mrs. Thatcher. The FA warns we could be banned abroad. Lebanon, now the French to pull out as well. Remarrying in church, another step to help divorced people. And a royal premiere for racing's champion. Good evening. The government has won its fight to get rid of unions at the Cheltenham Communications Centre. The civil service unions have conceded that the vast majority of staff have now signed the government's form.
And that's how we'll be spending the rest of Tuesday evening on BBC One.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Julia Somerville and Andrew Harvey.
Mrs. Thatcher says Lord Stockton was a great statesman, a great person, unique in our affections.
Mr. Gorbachev says there's no point in sending a New Year message to the Americans.
New twists in the Guinness affair. A merchant bank pulls out and a finance director resigns.
Zambia and Zimbabwe threaten sanctions against South Africa.
And game to the last, Britain's ski jumper. Good evening. All day long, the tributes have been pouring in for Lord Stockton, Harold Macmillan as he was, the former Conservative Prime Minister who died last night, aged 92.
And before we make the visit, the 9 o'clock news now on BBC One with Martin Lewis.
South Africa's President Botha intervenes to save the Sharpeville Six from the gallows. The sister of one of them talks of her delight and relief. And for babies, pregnant mothers and old people, a government health warning on eating lightly cooked eggs. Good evening. The South African President, P.W. Botha, has reprieved the Sharpeville Six 3 years after they were first put on death row.
The news now on BBC One with John Humphreys. The time, 9 o'clock.
The minister who's under pressure to resign has said, "I was foolish, but I won't be driven from office." Tonight he's meeting local party leaders in his constituency. John Hume puts more pressure on Sinn Féin to accept the Downing Street Declaration. And discipline in the classroom. Teachers say the government's guidelines don't give them the help they need. Good evening. The Environment Minister, Tim Yeo, admitted today that he'd acted very foolishly by having an affair with a Tory councillor and fathering her child.
The main evening news now on BBC One with Nicholas Witchell.
Radical changes in the way we elect MPs have been recommended at Westminster. Lord Jenkins said his proposals would be fairer, but Labour and the Conservatives are divided. Ron Davies has withdrawn as Labour's candidate to lead the new Welsh Assembly. South Africa's apartheid system was a crime against humanity, but Archbishop Tutu says the ANC was guilty too. And blasting off again at the age of 77, the shuttle takes John Glenn back into space. Good evening. Fundamental changes in the way we elect our MPs have been recommended in a report commissioned by Tony Blair.
The BBC News now on BBC One with Peter Sissons.
Peter Mandelson returns from the wilderness in Tony Blair's biggest reshuffle. He gets Mo Molan's job. She's the Cabinet's new enforcer. The Queen sees the Paddington wreckage as ministers question Railtrack's functions. And tough new rules for house sales, but no ban on gazumping. Good evening. Tony Blair's cabinet became even more a new Labour cabinet today, and the centrepiece was the return of Peter Mandelson.
Farmers are threatening to block the government's mass slaughter of healthy animals. Some are resigned to it, but others are threatening a rural revolt. The next Balkan flashpoint, the government says they're on the brink of war. And Spurs give George Graham the boot.
Stephen Lawrence's father on the law change that could see his son's suspected killers back in the dock. And a rare court verdict, the woman facing jail after being convicted of rape.
Good evening. There's growing opposition in the parts of the country worst affected by foot and mouth disease to the new government plans for mass slaughter of healthy animals.
By a whisker, the Prime Minister survives the crucial vote on university tuition fees.
The ayes to the right, 316. The noes to the left, 311.
Mr Blair's majority cut to just 5. It's the biggest revolt on domestic policy since Labour came to power. We'll be assessing the political damage as the bill's opponents promise that the fight isn't over yet. Also tonight, on the eve of the Hutton report, the Sun newspaper claims it has the conclusions. No animal testing centre in Cambridge. Scientists worry about security threats. And the easy favourite to triumph at the Oscars, the final instalment of Lord of the Rings.
And in BBC London News, streets, fines and videotape, a speed camera for every road in the capital. And tune in to Wandsworth Jail as the country's first prison radio takes to the airwaves.
Good evening. Tony Blair's solid parliamentary majority was reduced to just 5 tonight when MPs voted on his plans for higher university fees in England.
The International Olympic Committee has the honour of announcing that the Games of the 30th Olympiad in 2012 are awarded to the City of London. To the City of London.
We've done it! London have won it!
Jubilation in London and in Singapore as the Olympic race is won. Britain's vision of reconnecting youth with sport wins the day and ministers rejoice.
Well, it's not often in this job that you sort of punch the air and do a little jig and embrace the next person standing next to you.
But in Paris, the long-standing favourite, there's silence and dismay. We'll have all the reaction in Singapore and here at home. Also tonight, the world's richest nations gather for the G8 summit at Gleneagles. But outside, there are dozens of arrests as police clash with demonstrators.
In BBC London News, Stratford celebrates as the Olympic dream becomes reality. And just what won the bid behind the scenes with the capital's victorious team in Singapore.
Good evening. The Olympic Games will come to London in 2012. After a tense voting session earlier today, London eventually beat Paris by just 4 votes.
John Prescott says he will give up his Grace and Favour home at Dorneywood. Amid the mounting controversy over his official residence, he says he wasn't forced out. But in a statement, the Deputy Prime Minister admits his country home had become an increasing source of concern in his own party. Also tonight, America moves to end the nuclear standoff with Iran. It offers direct talks for the first time in 27 years. The victims of Europe's growing mountain of old computers and TVs, we've a special report. And after the wettest May for 20 years, why is there still a drought?
In the south, fighting for his life, a young man is stabbed as he tries to stop an attack on a woman. His parents appeal for help. And coming home early, a sickness virus hits holidaymakers on board the Sea Princess.
Good evening. In the last hour, it's emerged that John Prescott will move out of his Grace and Favour home at Dorneywood.
Hand on heart, I did what I thought was right. I may have been wrong. That's your call. But believe one thing, if nothing else. I did what I thought was right for our country.
The end of an era. Tony Blair defends his decade in power as he announces he's stepping down as Prime Minister. He said 10 years at number 10 was long enough for him and for the country.
This is the greatest nation on earth. So it has been an honour to serve it.
After the euphoria of 1997, we'll be asking, did Tony Blair deliver on his promises? We'll be looking at the questions that will not go away over the war in Iraq. and the new, more informal style of leadership that Mr. Blair ushered in.
Look at my face.
Right, what are you doing?
Is my face bothered?
Right, wait a minute.
Does my face look bothered though?
Now, are you messing with my mind?
Face bothered. Top shop, centre parts, trainers, small feet, rich tea, bandages, Ryan, Lees. I ain't bothered.
In other news, another hike in interest rates. They're at their highest level in 6 years. And the pain is unending for the parents of Madeleine McCann. Tonight, police in Portugal say they're studying CCTV footage.
In BBC London News, it's where he spent his career and the place he'll continue to live. But what has Blair done for London? And red faces at Wembley as thousands of seats need to be replaced.
Very good evening from Downing Street for a special edition of the 10 o'clock news on the day Tony Blair announced his resignation as Labour leader and Prime Minister. Tonight at 10, record borrowing and tax rises. The Chancellor's response to the worst recession since the Second World War. Mr. Darling's budget reveals the toxic state of the economy, and he announces unprecedented borrowing to try to put it right.
Our own figures for public sector net borrowing will be £175 billion this year, or some 12% of GDP.
The worst recession since World War II and the worst peacetime public finances ever known. As of today, any claim they have ever made to economic competence is dead over, finished.
The wealthiest are targeted with a higher top rate of income tax and lower pension relief. Drinkers and motorists will also share the burden as duties rise. And a warning that public spending will have to be cut back radically in the years ahead. We'll be asking how credible the government's plans and predictions really are. Also tonight, freed without charge, police release all the suspects arrested in the recent anti-terror raids. After last year's SATS chaos, the former exams chief says he was made a scapegoat by ministers. And did Manchester United do enough tonight to regain the top spot?
On BBC London News, a gimmick which pokes the rich in the eye. The Mayor slams the budget for damaging the city. And new pictures emerge showing Ian Tomlinson after being pushed at the G20 protests.
Good evening. Tax rises, public spending cuts and record levels of borrowing. That's the Chancellor's response to the sharpest recession since the Second World War. Tonight at 10, 5 party leaders in the latest campaign debate with Labour and the SNP at loggerheads. There were vigorous exchanges on the NHS and immigration before the SNP issued a challenge to Labour.
So tell me tonight, is it the case that you would rather see David Cameron go back into Downing Street than work with the SNP?
No,
surely that cannot be your position.
I've fought Tories all my life. Unlike the SNP, which presaged a Tory government in 1979. Unlike your leader, Alex Salmond, who said vote Lib Dem in 2010, and we end up with a Lib Dem Tory coalition.
I was
and unlike you at this election, you fought Labour all your life, Nicola.
We have a chance to...
Participants did not include David Cameron and Nick Clegg. We'll be tracking some of the instant responses to tonight's debate.
I'll be bringing you live reaction to the debate from our audience of floating voters.
We'll have more on the events of the day, which included a £1 million donation to UKIP from the owner of Express newspapers, also tonight. The politician Lord Janner will not face a trial on child sex abuse charges for health reasons. Police have condemned the decision. Detectives confirm that a body found on farmland near Glasgow is that of the missing student Karen Buckley. And as some migrants are rescued from the Mediterranean, reports that more have drowned crossing from North Africa.
Here, supply and demand, the growing pressure on school places felt by parents in the south. And an area of Heathland the size of more than 40 football pitches is devastated by a major fire in Surrey.
Good evening. 5 party leaders have taken part in the BBC's election debate this evening at Westminster. Some of the most vigorous exchanges were on the issues of immigration and the economy. Tonight at 10, levels of greenhouse gases break new records as experts express their fears for the future of the planet. Since 1990, there's been an increase of 43% in the warming effect on the climate of a range of greenhouse gases. Last year's increase in emissions was bigger than the previous 12 months and higher than the average of the past decade.
The critical period is now, and that the climate change we'll see and the decisions that we make will last not just for decades, not even centuries, but potentially longer than that.
We'll be looking at the latest figures amid criticism that the world's nations are simply not delivering on the promises that they've made. Also tonight, after 39 migrants' bodies were found in a lorry container in Essex, a man pleads guilty to plotting to assist illegal immigration. Labour says if it wins power, it'll put bad landlords out of business and bring in rent controls in England. The cinema operator View defends its decision to withdraw the gang film Blue Story after violent incidents outside several of its venues. And we travel to Italy to meet the oldest living survivor of the Nazi concentration camps.
And coming up on Sports Day on BBC News, England's Jofra Archer says he was racially abused on the final day of the first test against New Zealand. Both cricket boards are investigating.
Good evening. One of the world's leading experts on climate change says he's now scared for the future of the planet, following the latest report by the World Meteorological Organization. Tonight at 10, counting the immense economic cost of the pandemic as the Chancellor delivers his budget. In the red box, a series of measures that will take the UK's overall tax burden to its highest level since the 1960s.
Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
He said the furlough scheme and support for the self-employed would be extended, but he needed to raise more in tax to help pay for it all.
Just as it would be irresponsible to withdraw support too soon, it would also be irresponsible to allow our future borrowing and debt to rise unchecked.
Chancellor warned it would take a long time for the economy to recover from the pandemic. Labour said the budget barely papered over the cracks.
This is a budget that didn't even attempt to rebuild the foundations of our economy or to secure the country's long-term prosperity.
We'll be looking at the measures in detail and the tax implications for individuals and for business. Also tonight, Scotland's First Minister defends her handling of allegations of harassment against her predecessor and former friend, Alex Salmond.
I must rebut the absurd suggestion that anyone acted with malice or as part of a plot against Alex Salmond.
And Buckingham Palace say that they will investigate claims that the Duchess of Sussex bullied some members of her staff.
And coming up in sport on BBC News, Rangers move within 4 points of the Scottish Premiership title as Alfredo Morelos leaves it late to beat Livingston.
Good evening. The enormous cost of shoring up the economy because of the pandemic has been spelled out by the Chancellor in today's budget. Tonight at 10, we're live in Downing Street, where Boris Johnson is defying a chorus of calls from colleagues for him to resign. As he left for the Commons earlier today, Prime Minister was aware that dozens of ministers and aides were heading for the exit. So far, there have been at least 43 resignations. It's a record number for one day. But the Prime Minister responded with defiance to critics on his own side. At Westminster tonight, the Prime Minister is still determined to hang on, and he's still hiring and firing.
Does the Prime Minister think there are any circumstances in which he should resign?
Frankly, Mr. Speaker, the job of a Prime Minister in difficult circumstances when he's been handed a colossal mandate is to keep going, and that's what I'm going to do.
Anyone quitting now, after defending all that, hasn't got a shred of integrity. Mr. Speaker, isn't this the first recorded case of the sinking ships fleeing the rat?
Well, a short while ago, we were told that the Prime Minister has sacked Michael Gove, one of the government's most senior figures. We'll have more on that. Also tonight, British Airways cuts a further 10,000 short-haul flights from now to the end of October. And in football, England get off to a winning start in the opening match of the Women's Euros at Old Trafford.
And stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Very good evening from Downing Street, where Boris Johnson is tonight being urged to resign by some of his most senior colleagues, who believe he has clearly lost the confidence of most of his MPs.